Well, hello everyone. This is Matt Brotherton with 1752 Financial, and we have a guest today with us, Jake Grimza from Franklin Templeton. And throughout the year, last year, this year, a lot of clients have been asking more and more about Medicare, and we were lucky enough to have Jake come on today to go through the presentation. Obviously, if there are questions or things that you need clarity on, please just reach out, let me know, and we can reach out to Jake and other experts and get this all taken care of. So it's a broad topic, but looking ahead at the presentation, I know Jake's going to do a great job for us. So we appreciate his time in advance. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Jake.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, folks, for joining today's webinar. This is a very important topic. And as you are starting to get older and getting to the age of having to make decisions about Medicare, it's very important to be informed because there's a lot of nuance and small details, as we'll see in future slides, that you'll want to be aware of. Before we do jump into that, as Matt mentioned, my name is Jake Gremza. I'm a certified financial planner and a wealth planning specialist here with Franklin Templeton. Like Matt, I was an advisor at one point and kind of jumped over to the dark side, if you will, of asset management, and now work in a subject matter capacity to help educate Matt and his clients, so namely yourselves, about these important planning topics. So with that, we'll jump into the slides, what you came here for. And to actually get started, so what exactly is Medicare? And as you'll see, there's a lot of interesting points here on the slide. But realistically, Medicare is meant to supplement senior folks that are nearing and entering into retirement and helping to offset the costs of medical care. As we know, the expenses associated with medicine are extremely expensive and continuing to go up, right? The cost of medical expenses is increasing faster than inflation and really everything else that we have to pay for. And without Medicare, the reality is that a lot of people would struggle to afford the bills associated with going to see their doctor and going to the hospital. As we know, as we get older, no one typically is getting healthier. And realistically, at some point in your life, you'll have medical expenses, and Medicare and the associated plans, which we'll talk about, are there to be that safety net for you. So to really understand what is Medicare foundationally, there are three different parts. So we have Part A, Part B, and Part D. And you might say, Jake, what happened to Part C? And I'll talk all about that in just a future slide. But Part A is your hospital insurance. It's the part that you hope to not have to use frequently, but it is there just in case. Typically, there's no premium associated with that. And it's really meant for, again, hospital stays, nursing care, hospice to a degree. We'll talk about that in some more detail. This typically has some co-insurance with it for hospital stays as well as hospice care. And we'll talk about more about some of the deductibles and costs in a future slide. Part D is really the part that people are using most commonly. The coverage that you already have through work is really aligned with Part D. So it's your doctor visits, outpatient procedures, labs, testing, therapy, x-rays, those kinds of more routine and common type of expenses. I will note Part B and Part D are a little bit different from Part A in that there are base premiums. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. But unlike Part A, which typically has no premium associated with it, these do have premiums, and they can also be dependent on what your income looks like, and we'll talk about that. All right, so we talked about Part A and B. Part D is your prescription drug coverage. There's different tiers, and we can talk about that, but basically tier 1 through 4, and tier 1 being the most basic prescription drugs, up to tier 4, which is your more nuanced type of drugs typically associated with chronic diseases, cancer, and things like that. So that's kind of your what we call original foundational Medicare. To look a little bit deeper, so I mentioned that there's base premium, so you can see that as the top line item there. So Part B, the base premium for 2025, when we're recording this, is $185. It goes up slightly each year. And Part D is just about $37. Now, each state is a little bit different, so just be aware that although these are the base premiums, depending on the state that you live in, as well as how much income that you earn on an annual basis, can affect what these premiums look like. But that is basically the minimum that you'd have to pay. So just be aware of that. Also, deductibles are different. So depending on which type of part of Medicare that you're using has different deductibles. A deductible is simply the amount that you have to pay out of pocket before the insurance kind of kicks in and says, okay, you've paid your fair share. Now we're going to start to pick up the costs. So just be aware that the different parts also have different deductibles, and we'll actually talk about what you can do in terms of supplemental coverage to potentially eliminate those. So before we do that, I'd like to talk a little bit more about actually enrolling in Medicare. So how does it actually work from a mechanical standpoint? So what you can do is there is an initial enrollment period. So if you are already retired, let's say, and you're reaching age 65, you can enroll in your Medicare benefits up to 3 months before you actually turn 65. So there is basically a 7 month window, the 3 months before the actual month that you turn 65, and then the 3 months after. You might ask, well, what happens if I miss that window? We'll talk about that. There's actually some penalties as a result of missing that. So you definitely don't want to do that. I will just note that once you are enrolled in Medicare, that you can no longer contribute to a health savings account. So just be aware of that. When you turn 65, if you plan on continuing to work, you don't have to run out and go enroll in Medicare. It's an important distinction because if you are enrolled in Medicare and are making contributions to a health savings account, you'll end up having to take out any excess contributions that you accidentally made, and there's also a penalty as well for having done that. So something that you want to avoid at all costs. I will just mention for those of you, if you're planning on enrolling in Social Security before you turn age 65, you're automatically enrolled in Part A as a result of enrolling in Social Security. So just something to be aware of. Now, once you have enrolled, once we get past that initial enrollment step, if you want to make any changes to your coverage, you're more than welcome to do that. There is a general enrollment period, and we'll talk about that as well. But typically, there's two. There's one that is at the beginning of the year, which is for Medicare Advantage plans, and then there's also one later in the year where you can enroll and disenroll. So just something to be aware of. So you can change your plans and what your coverage looks like. Now, I alluded to the fact that if you are still working past age 65, that you actually don't have to enroll in Medicare right away. And so for people that might be your situation, once you separate from service with your employer and you no longer have employer sponsored health coverage, you can actually enroll in Medicare at that time. You enroll under what's called the SEP, the special enrollment period, and you actually have 8 months after you separate from your employer's plan to enroll in your Medicare benefits. You might ask, Jake, uh, why do these people get 8 months and people that are not in that situation have 7? I don't know. That's just what the government decided. So I don't know how they choose to do these things. I just know how it works. So I alluded to the fact that there's some late enrollment penalties if you don't enroll in Medicare. Specifically, it depends on which part and how long you wait. But this slide focuses on Part B. So how does it actually work? Well, let's say you wait until age 66, there would be a 10% penalty for your Part B premiums. And that's not a one-time 10% penalty. That is for the rest of your life. So if your premiums were, let's say, $200 and you wait an extra year, you're paying an additional $20 in penalty basically for the rest of your life. So definitely do not want to delay. You want to make sure that you're being timely in terms of when you enroll. Now, again, I just want to emphasize for those people in that special enrollment period, so people that continue to work and have health employer-sponsored health care coverage, this does not apply uh, as long as you're enrolling within that 8-month period after you separate from service. So just a distinction there. The penalty only applies if you are beyond that window, regardless of whether it's the age 65 window or at the time of separating employment. So just want to clear that up. Now, not only does Part B have penalties, but D also has penalties as well. So that one is a little bit shorter. For Part D, you only have 63 days without credible drug coverage. And again, doesn't matter whether it's under the general initial enrollment or the special initial enrollment. You only have 63 days basically without drug coverage. And what does that penalty looks like? It's actually a little bit steeper. So it's 1% for each month that you didn't sign up for Part D. So if we use that same example, now you're paying even more than $20 per month if you had waited that 1 year. You're paying 22, I think, 21. I don't know. My math skills clearly are not good enough. Either way, you're paying a penalty for having waited. So you don't ideally want to do that. All right. So I alluded to the effects that we have A, we have B, we have D, and what happened to C? Well, C is now this Medicare Advantage, and we also have Medigap as well, which is kind of the brother or sister of Part C. So Medicare Advantage is really a bundling of a bunch of different coverages. I'll start on that side. Typically, Medicare Advantage plans are associated with lower premiums, but there's a give and take to everything, right? So as a result of that, typically you have to pay more out of pocket for medical related expenses. So something to be aware of. Medicare Advantage plans, like I said, typically will bundle coverages. So on top of having your hospital and your kind of doctor coverage, they'll also bundle together things like vision, dental, hearing, and typically the Part D, the prescription. So it's a little bit more of a cheaper one size fits all offering. However, the coverage is typically a little bit more limited. Another potential negative, depending on your area, is that Medicare Advantage plans are very regionalized and specific. So depending on the hospital and coverage networks that are in your region, they're going to look different. And they also act like a health maintenance organization where you typically have to see your primary care doctor and then get referrals before you go and see a specialist. So those are some of the potential drawbacks there, is that if you have a specialist or go to a hospital that's out of network, this type of coverage may not actually cover you for those expenses. So something to be aware of. On the other hand, we have Medigap, and Medigap is more comprehensive. So anywhere that actually accepts Medicare in general is going to accept a Medigap policy. Now, the trade-off for that, again, is higher premiums. I mentioned that certain deductibles can potentially be offset. A lot of Medigap policies, as a result of paying a higher premium, will either eliminate or virtually eliminate your deductible. So instead of having a deductible that may be several hundreds or even $1,000, well, maybe instead it's 200 or 20 or something very low. So just something to be aware of. Not advocating necessarily for either one, because again, Medicare coverage is very individualized and regional, but just something to be aware of there. So this is kind of the two paths. Again, if you're on original Medicare, you can add Part D coverage, excuse me, as well as a Medigap. You can have just original Medicare alone, or you can kind of stack a Medicare Advantage plan that is, again, kind of bundling all of these things together. Which one to choose? Again, it's very dependent on what your medical situation looks like, which is why you want to be having conversations with Matt and ideally a Medicare broker, someone that's knowledgeable about the plans that are specific to what are available based off of your region and your situation. All right, so open enrollment periods, I already talked a bit about these, but just something to be aware of. The fall time, which a lot of people are familiar with, you have your open enrollment, and this is really a two-way street. So you can enroll and make changes, and you can disenroll in original Medicare and Medicare Advantage plans. So it's really wide open in terms of what you can do. Alternatively, there's also the Medicare Advantage disenrollment period. So these are only for people that are enrolled in an Advantage plan, and it's a one-way street in that you can only disenroll from the coverage that you have existing. So typically, if you're jumping off a Medicare Advantage Part D plan, and maybe it's just because you're not using it or you made a mistake when you initially enrolled. So just something to be aware of. I'll mention with Medigap, so something to be aware of when, regardless of whether you are using that initial enrollment period when you're 65 or the special enrollment period, and you're actually enrolling in a Medigap plan, ideally, again, timing matters here. You want to enroll within that period because if you have some kind of underlying condition, there is guaranteed issuance. If you are beyond that period, you miss the window, what ends up happening is to actually get a Medigap policy, you will have to go through medical underwriting. And so they may exclude certain coverages or the premiums may be exceptionally higher. So again, timing is very important in terms of when you're actually enrolling in Medicare. So a common issue that I ran into when I was an advisor, and a lot of advisors are telling me, is for people that are retiring before the age of 65 and need coverage. Like, what do we actually do? And there are some options. So the first option is that you can jump on COBRA, which is a government provided health insurance type of plan. Typically, these premiums are pretty high. I know when I was at a previous firm earlier and had to jump off for a couple months, they had sent me a notice and say, hey, you can enroll in Cobra. And I think the premiums for myself, I'm a young unmarried guy, were $600. So definitely quite expensive, and that's per month. So typically not the most affordable, and you can only actually be on Cobra for up to 18 months. So it's not permanent and it's very expensive. Now, what you could do is if you have a spouse, you can always jump onto their plan, be on a family plan, and especially if they have a great insurance coverage, then that's probably a win-win for everyone. If that's not the case, there's also marketplace plans. So typically every state will have some kind of marketplace plan where you can go and they have different tiers of service and you can pick whichever one makes the most sense for you. Typically they'll have a high deductible plan where you're kind of paying up front and the premiums are lower. And then on the opposite end of the scale, they'll have something where the premiums are higher, but typically there's either no or very little deductibles. So kind of two ends of the seesaw there. And then finally, we have specialty coverage. Realistically, this probably doesn't make sense for a lot of people. They typically are only providing some kind of catastrophic coverage for disability or if you get seriously injured. So it's not kind of your standard type coverage, but just something to be aware of. There are some other types of plans out there that potentially could make sense for your situation. And yeah, with that, that's a general overview. We'll kick it back to Matt, and I think he has some questions for me to answer, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. This was great, and healthcare alone is a wide topic, and Medicare is just as wide. So this is super helpful to get some more information and details. There were a couple questions that did come in. The first one was you mentioned the HSA. So the question was what to do, like once you hit Medicare age, and obviously, like you said, you can't contribute to an HSA, but what should you do with the HSA, or what would you recommend doing with it? And then the follow-up is, can you use your HSA to pay the premiums on, let's say, the Medigap insurance? So two
Yeah.
questions there on the HSA.
Yeah. No, great. Two great questions. So realistically, it doesn't mean that you can't have an HSA once you're enrolled in Medicare. It just means you can't continue to make contributions. So what you can do if you've already been enrolled in Part A, not much you can really do at that point because again, you're kind of locked in. However, if you're planning to work past age 65, you don't have to enroll in Medicare Part A right away. So if you know you're going to work until age 70, well, just don't enroll in Part A at 65. You can wait until you're going to enroll in BD, whatever other supplemental plans, if that's what you plan on doing. Just enroll in everything at once, and you can continue to contribute to your HSA for that time, as long as you're not enrolling in Social Security, as I mentioned, because enrolling in Social Security, you're automatically enrolled in Part A. So some nuance there. Once, eventually, once you enroll in Medicare to whatever extent that may be, you can actually use your HSA to pay the premiums for whatever coverage that you have. So that's a massive benefit. And if you don't want to do that, you can always have your premiums be deducted from your Social Security check once you turn that on. So there's basically two ways where if you don't want to pay those premiums out of pocket, that you can pay for them in other ways. So that's a nice benefit as well.
Great. That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Another question that just came in was, are most physicians affiliated with Medicare?
That's a great question. I would give you my best economist answer, which is it depends. And the reason for that is because some some doctors are fee for service, so they don't even accept insurance. And it really also depends on the network. So depending on where you are in the country, different networks accept different kinds of insurances. So you also have to be aware when you're enrolling, especially in Medicare Advantage plans, that the doctors or specialists that you want or plan to see are actually covered within that network and that Advantage plan that you're purchasing. Again, if you're a Medigap person and you're planning on purchasing one of those, as long as the doctor accepts Medicare at all, they will accept your Medigap plan.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
Good economist answer there. It
Yeah,
always depends, right?
right, exactly.
Uh, somebody else asked, is there a good online resource that you'd recommend to getting more information or more specific information for their needs?
Well, if you want to go to the horse's mouth, you can go to the health or the Medicare website. I believe if you go to ssa.gov, which is the Social Security website, they'll also have a link there. So there's multiple kind of ways to get there. I would
Okay.
say primarily that is the best source because they have it all laid out. Now, is it easy to read and navigate? No, I think it's a 200-page document in most years, and it probably gets longer every year. So there's that. Obviously, if you have specific questions that are for yourself or your spouse, what have you, obviously come to Matt and he can always come to me as well. Or alternatively, you can work with Matt and a knowledgeable Medicare broker, someone that would know the ins and outs of the policies that are specific to your region and network. So those are probably my best suggestions there.
Okay. Thank you. Most government websites are super easy to read, so that I'm sure Medicare.gov is just as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh, I think the last question it looks like is, are there any big holes in Medicare? Like, meaning, are there things that surgeries, mechanical devices, things that aren't covered in general?
Yeah, good question. Well, there used to be what was called the donut hole, which was basically um, once you had reached your deductible, especially for certain types of specialty drugs, where then you would have a co-insurance. So even though you met your deductible, the insurance company says, hey, you're still on the hook for, let's say, 20% of whatever the cost is. And so for people that were, let's say, on cancer or excuse me, had cancer or had to be on some kind of medication for some kind of rare chronic disease, that could potentially mean that they would have to come out of pocket for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Luckily, that kind of donut hole was actually closed a few years ago during Biden's administration, which is nice. So not exactly. It really is client specific, I would say. There's probably some things that are not included, medical devices. It depends on the necessity of the medical device. So again, I would say kind of this depends on the situation and what exactly that you're using. But by and large, for the vast majority of people, your common prescription drugs, going to see the doctor for, labs and x-rays, testing, just saying hello on your annual appointment, and then uh, I would say your kind of average length stays in the hospital, hospice, things like that are going to be covered by your Medicare coverage. When we get into the longer end of hospital stays and assisted living, nursing home care, that's when you may not be covered. It depends on the length, basically, that you're in those places. So again, it's a little bit a little bit of a gray area there, but it's very client specific. So
Great. That makes sense. Yeah, I think so much of healthcare is so specific to that person and where they live, what plan they're on, et cetera. So it makes
absolutely,
sense. Always good to check with the physician's office, as I'm sure they can help navigate the system as well.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this was great. There's no more questions here on our side. So, Jake, obviously I appreciate your time and energy and knowledge on this subject. It's a vast subject, and you're obviously a well-spoken, well-versed on it. So, we appreciate your help. We appreciate your insight. And if there are any follow-up questions from clients, feel free to reach out, and we'll do our best to get you the information. So, thank you
Awesome.
again for attending, and hope to hear from you all soon.